the number of people you need to be optimistic is going to vary greatly. If you need 6 people and you only got 3, it's going to be hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel. If you only need 2 and you got 10, it's going to feel overwhelming. Hi, dreamers. Welcome back to the Dreaming Forward podcast. It's a new month, and I took a break last week because I miscounted the weeks. And I didn't realize that there were 5 in April. For some reason, I thought there were 5 in May. So you got a week off, but I am back. And the theme for this month is going to be leader optimism. Of course, you all probably have seen all of the headlines, and there's a lot going on. There's a lot to be aware of, maybe even a few things to be nervous about. But as leaders, we must work at being as optimistic as possible because our optimism and our outlook determines how the team flows. And I'll get more into that in a second. Let's take a pause for the cause and talk for a second about what we did last month or for the last 6 or 7 weeks. And that was talk about resilience. Resilience requires a lot out of us. And optimism, I felt, was the next step to that because sometimes you can be so resilient that you become hardened over time. And optimism requires a certain level of softness and a certain level of pliability to be able to navigate. So, what is optimism? Y'all know I love words, so I'm going to pull out my trusty, dusty phone and I'll read the definition. This is coming from dictionary.com. It says that optimism is a disposition or tendency to look on the more favorable side of events or conditions and to expect the most favorable outcome. Number 2, the belief that good ultimately predominates over evil in the world. Number 3, the belief that goodness pervades reality. That means it spreads all throughout it. And finally, and this one was very interesting to me, it is the doctrine that the existing world is the best of all possible worlds. So fascinating to me to think about optimism because I think when we consider optimism, we think of that first definition that you're looking on the more favorable side. But the reality is it takes work to get there. And I think that the other definitions, and I'll refer back to this throughout the conversation, are relevant to that too. The idea that good ultimately prevails over evil. That's an acknowledgement that things are going to happen that we will not like, that we will not be comfortable with, that will feel frustrating, make us angry, fearful at times, but that at the end result is going to be good. I'd like to present another perspective of that. And some of this kind of comes from my faith. The song I Won't Complain comes to mind. But it is the idea that when we add up the sum total of events and their impact, that the good will have outweighed the bad. And so then the net outcome is still positive. You think back to 9th grade algebra when we would add up, let's say, a positive 16 plus a negative 7. The net result is still a positive 9 because all of the positive numbers outweighed all of the negative numbers. And so the result still comes out as a positive. I love that perspective, I think, more than anything, because sometimes in the thick of stuff, we are not going to be able to be optimistic in that moment. But as leaders, one of the traits that I think is most important is the ability to reflect and assess in a fair way. What does that mean? It means that in the midst of emotional highs, sometimes emotional lows, as a leader, it is my responsibility to be able to take a step back, either physically or mentally or emotionally, and look at, from a bird's eye view, what is really happening, what is possible, and what are the possible outcomes that will lead the team forward in the way that is best for us. I bring this up because, again, there are some things that are coming out in the news, whether about the economy, politically, socially, that are a little concerning. Inflation is still a huge issue. We are still dealing with many geopolitical conflicts across the globe. there's an election coming up in the United States and other places. There's just a lot of confusion. And as leaders, we are still human. And unfortunately, a part of that humanity requires us to take a step back because people are still depending on us for things. So, what does it mean for a leader to cultivate optimism? I wanted to frame these conversations this month around 3 P's. Y'all know I love alliteration. Then the 3 P's are people, processes, and product or service if you're a service based leader. And so the people side, we're going to talk about who are the players in your ecosystem who you need to address and manage in order to maintain that optimism. I also want to talk about processes because that is often the missing link when we think about the difference between chaos and calm is good processes. And then finally, I want to talk about products. And that conversation, that's going to close us off at the end of the month, but I think you'll really enjoy that one. So let's get into it. Let's talk about people. Again, if optimism is the idea that good ultimately outweighs bad and that you are looking at the more favorable side, we cannot ignore the impact that people have on that ability to maintain optimism. All of us have a cast of characters in our lives. And some of us have way more characters than we know what to do with. If you think about a really good book, you have the protagonist, you have the villain, sometimes you might even have an anti-hero, you have the best friend, you have the villain's flying monkeys, you have all of these small characters that may show up on only one page or only in one chapter or only in one section, and they serve to either hinder or help the protagonist's journey. It's also called the hero's journey. And if you think about our journey as a leader, as a hero's journey, who is your villain? Who is your best friend? Who is in your cast of characters? Who is coming to help along the way? Who is coming along the way to hinder and frustrate? Now, the interesting part is that we love to deify the helpers. The helpers are amazing. They help us to become the best version of ourselves. They make decisions easy. They make trouble easy because they lighten the load. Samwise Gamgee from The Lord of the Rings comes to mind. We love a good Sam. Love a good Sam. But Sam also has the shadow side. And I actually talk about that in my book, Evolution to Equity, that Sam's shadow side is that he coddles Frodo in moments where Frodo actually needs to grow up and have a backbone. And that coddling ends up coming back to bite Sam in the behind at the close to the end of the third movie, Return of the King. And Frodo is unable to discern between true supporters versus true enemies because now the external environment has just caused so much frustration to him. He's worn out, he's burned out. So let's think about that as leaders. Who's your Sam? Who has helped you so much to the point that they've actually coddled you into infancy, into immaturity, in a moment where you actually need to grow up? And sometimes we can have people who help us so much that we don't realize how detrimental they can be to our decision making. One of your main functions as a leader is to make decisions. And sometimes that decision making means that you're empowering other people to make decisions. So who do you cede authority to? Who do you listen to and allow to influence you? If you have too many coddlers in your ecosystem, I guarantee you will not be ready when trouble comes. You will not be able to navigate external frustrations because you haven't built up that inner fortitude, that resilience that you need to do the hard things. And that ironically leads to pessimism. Because anytime any trouble comes, anytime any hard decision making comes, any type of stretch projects, stretch goals come, you'll feel like it's an attack. Anytime someone forces you out of your comfort zone just by having to make a decision, you'll feel like, oh my God, they're so unfair. I can't stand them. To this day, one of my most useful supervisors. She was not my favorite by any means. She was actually quite abusive. But one of my most useful supervisors was a woman who, I mean, she would tear my behind up at every decision. She constantly picked at me and criticized. But with all that criticism, she also gave me access to some of the best stretch projects that have grown my career. In a year and a half, it actually, I think, was less than a year and a half of working with her, I got a chance to touch every functional area of HR, every single functional area of HR, because she would load me up with these projects and she would expect me to produce and she would expect me to deliver and she expected a high bar. I'll never forget, I had to do these reports. I actually had about 10 of these reports to do in a month. They would do every single month. And I'm trying not to say it to give away who it was, but those reports had to go to a very important senior leader. I'm going to say that like that and leave it there. And each report, again, there are like 10, each report had about 500 pieces of data on it. And with those 500 pieces of data, I'll never forget one time across all 10 total, I had 5 errors. And they were easy to fix, but it was 5 errors. When I tell you she called me up to her office and let me have it, I came back to my desk crying. And everybody was like, "Oh my God, are you okay?" And I was like, "I hate her. I can't stand her. This is so unfair." But through that experience, and it was funny because she knew I was talking about her. And she would let me be mad that day. And then the next day she would call me in and explain why. What I learned is that there are some projects that are so high stakes, you can't afford to have any mistakes. The work must be flawless. And I had come from an industry where, because of my experience, my age, and youth at that time, because I was pretty young in my career, it was easy to stand out. I could operate at 70% and be like a top performer. I mean, top of the top across the industry, just because there were so many people there who had been in the industry a long time and they were kind of complacent, or it was just easy to shine through certain projects. I had a role that was highly visible. So in my mind, if something was a little messed up, okay, fine. And the excellence that she demanded from me forced me to be more than detail oriented. I mentioned in some earlier episodes, the out of scope episode in particular about leadership duality, that I'm not an operational leader. That job was the job that forced me to be both strategic and operational every day. And I constantly had to toggle between the two. And what that job taught me was that if excellence is not the standard, there is no way possible to be optimistic. Any optimism that is based in mediocrity is delusion. Because what are you optimistic about? Messing up? You optimistic about tearing stuff up? You optimistic about failing? Doing the bare minimum? No. It has to be excellence or nothing. And after I left that job, every job that I went to after that, the level of creativity that I displayed to do my work, was through the roof. Because I really was doing a job of, I think when I left, it took 3 people to replace me. I was doing a job of 3 people in one. It was insane. And I had a whole bunch of crazy stuff happening in my personal life too. But the point is, I learned through that relatively short experience. That job was probably a 10th of my professional career. Yeah, from start to now. But I learned in that little short experience the power of setting excellence as a standard. And because I understood what excellence can and should look like, I can look at things much more favorably because I see all the pieces. Again, I had to be strategic and operational. So I had to look, I had to understand. I knew she was going to ask all these questions. I knew the people that was expecting her to answer questions were going to have. I needed to have it tight. And that lack of coddling, that pushing, that punching, that needling, that is what gave me the knowledge that I needed to be optimistic, which leads me to my second point. It's very difficult to be optimistic if you do not have the right information. sticking with this particular job, maybe I'll just talk about this job when we talk about people today. There were so many data points needed to do this job. It was nuts. Every single day, I had to interface with about 15 departments across various locations. People worked different shifts. People had different tenures, different purviews, different levels of access to systems. And it was my responsibility to aggregate and synthesize, because those are two different things, that data to make a good decision. So let's talk about the aggregate side. Putting things together, literally just adding it up. So 4 plus 3 plus 10 plus aggregating the data. But then synthesizing takes it to the next level, because synthesizing says, I'm going to put together these pieces that seem so different to produce a different decision, a new outcome, a new solution than existed before. A part of what I was brought in to do, and a part of why she was so hard on me, was because I was brought in to reform a major program. And it was highly visible. There was all of these political motivations behind it that I didn't know anything about and didn't really have a dog in the fight. But it was important that this was done well and that I got it to a point. And in order to do that, I couldn't do it alone. I learned very early that there were times where I had to play good cop, bad cop. There were times where I had to be the villain. There was times where I had to be the hero. There were times where I had to be the negotiator. There were times where I had to, put a couple favors in, take a couple favors out. I had to really work hard to navigate people. And that was one of the first jobs where I had to navigate people at that level, at that scale. Again, 15 different departments. I think regularly that I had to have conversations with every week. It was about 50 people, which now just seems outrageous to me. But at that time, it was normal. Phone ringing off the hook, constantly, emails hitting all day. And a part of that was learning and understanding what information is important, what information I need to file away, what information is urgent, what information is irrelevant. Because everything seemed important to the person who was telling me. But I know, again, from having this bird's eye view, it's not relevant at all. That is actually wrong. That is not going to be relevant until next week. This I need now, and I don't have all the information I need to ask to follow up. This I need in an hour. And so learning what to do with knowledge was critical to my optimism. This also means, and we'll probably talk about this when we talk about processes too, this means that you got to have your systems together. And this is a tough one, because what's your system for getting information? Do you have the right reports? Do you have the right check-in meetings? Do you leverage team meetings appropriately? Because sometimes we handle things one-on-one and it should be handled in a group. So think about the tone and the cultural norms of your team. Some teams thrive on consensus, and so they will sit in meetings for hours until everyone agrees. You won't always have time for that. And then other teams, they thrive in conflict. You got the contrarians, the devil's advocates, all of those people, and they just gonna fight, 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 fight. That also can be a time waster. So how do you find that balance? How do you affirm the team as they have come to know it, while also motivating and pushing the team to be the best version of itself to be effective? And so sometimes that means, as a leader, you have to push people out of their comfort zone with the way that they connect as a group. So balancing how you leverage one-on-ones, team meetings, small group meetings. Not sometimes, a lot of times, you have to balance politics. So how can you use people's frustration at each other for the greater good? How can you use work buddies for the greater good? How can you use frenemies for the greater good? How can you use folks who have connections for the greater good? This is all a part of leader decision making, leader choices. It's not the prettiest side. It's the side that we don't always talk about, but it is no less important. And I want you all to be mindful that at the heart of all of that is people. because we don't get knowledge without people. We don't gain wisdom without people. And as a leader, if you have the wrong mix of people, the wrong players, the wrong characters in your story, it's going to be impossible to be optimistic. Sometimes you need that person who is pessimistic to drive your optimism. I love a good sandpaper person, and I talk about them a lot in my DEI trainings. So I love sandpaper people because it is often the pursuit of their silence and agreement that drives me to make the best possible solution. So I don't want to hear them out. I don't want to hear them say anything. I don't want to hear them push back. I don't want to hear them say, well, have we thought about? I don't want to hear the devil's advocate arguments. I don't want to hear the but what if. I don't want to hear any of that. So because I don't want to hear any of that from them, I'm going to think about every possible issue, every part that they could have a problem with, and I'm going to address it. And I know if I present this and they don't have any pushback, they can't say nothing. That's a good solution. So don't be so quick to dismiss your sandpaper people. The other side of the sandpaper people is, why have they become sandpaper people? Sometimes people are sandpaper people because they liked the leader before you. And that's something we don't like, especially if we didn't like that leader. So if they were the buddy of the leader before you, and you got brought in because the person who promoted you didn't like that leader, you're going to get some pushback from them. And they might not mean any harm. They just have an allegiance to that person. The dope part about people like that, in my experience, is that if you can find a way to win them over, they are going to be your best advocate. Because 9 times out of 10, other people trust them in ways that you may not be able to access yet. So I have a job that comes to mind. I can't remember if I talked about this on the podcast, but I came to the job and it was a clique of folks who would come early and they would just be gossiping and talking. So in my pursuit to be impressive in my early tenure at this job, I would come early too. And I remember when I would round the corner to come to my seat, because they could hear the door when it would open, they would get quiet and then they would just start whispering and just turn around. I was like, dang, they don't like me. I didn't do nothing to them. And eventually it came out that they thought that I was the family member of the big boss who they couldn't stand. So they wouldn't talk around me. But then when they figured out through essentially sending somebody to be like a flying monkey to figure out what type of side I was on, and they realized that I wasn't related to anybody, I just applied for the job like everybody else. Then all of a sudden they became my buddies, and they were like aunties slash mamas slash grandmas, and so they put me up on all of this game and would tell me who to talk to get this done and this and that, and they would be really celebratory and they would always compliment my work, and they really helped my ego a lot because you do need that. But it was just so funny to me because I called them on it later. I said, why wouldn't y'all talk to me? They said, girl, we thought you was so-and-so niece. So we ain't want to talk around you because we can't stand her. So again, sometimes sandpaper people exist because loyalty matters to them. And if loyalty matters very much to them, they will not deal with you until you can prove that you are worth their loyalty. All right. Last point I'm going to make about people. The number of people you need to be optimistic is going to vary greatly. There are times where you only need one good person in your corner. And then there are times where you might need 5 or 6 in different places, time zones, functional areas, whatever the case may be. Knowing your right mix and ratio is going to be key to cultivating optimism as a leader. If you need 6 people and you only got 3, it's going to be hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel. If you only need 2 and you got 10, it's going to feel overwhelming because you balancing 10 personalities, 10 ideas, 10 needs. It's too much. So as a leader, this might not even be something that you want to do at work. You might want to reserve some time for this at home. As a leader, I would strongly encourage you to take some reflection time at least once a week and think about the value add of the roles on the team. So not assigning people yet, but just thinking about what does each role add right now. And if you want to know more about roles, I actually have a tetrad. It's called the Workplace Persona Tetrad. And it is discussed in my book, Evolution to Equity. I'll link that in the description. But you need different mixes of people for things, and only you can determine that based on the business's needs, based on what's coming up in the time frame, whether that's the month, the quarter, the year. But that mix and that number of people is key. Because again, if you got too many and you only need a few, every day is gonna feel like a fight. And if you don't have enough and you need some more and can't find them in enough time, every day is gonna feel like defeat. So with that being said, let me know, what has been your most important lesson that you learned about the importance of people in your journey of optimism? What does optimism mean to you? How do you cultivate optimism? Let me know down in the comments. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And I'm going to catch you in the next one. Bye, dreamers.